Hi guys, here are your notes for section 2.2. This stuff is mildly tough, so make sure if you have questions you write them down, and me or Mrs. Carroll can answer them tomorrow. So the whole idea of this lesson is we're going to talk about conditional statements. So a conditional statement can be written in the form if P, then Q. So P and Q are two different statements. So if it rains today, then I'm not going hunting. So the hypothesis is the P part of the statement, and it always follows the word if. And the conclusion is the Q part. So hypothesis and conclusion, I don't know, for Q. Hypothesis has a P in it though. So your hypothesis comes first and then your conclusion. So some of the questions you're going to get are going to ask you to just identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. So let's say we'll make the conclusion yellow and we'll make the hypothesis blue. So if Megan lives in Lansing, then she lives in Michigan. So the hypothesis part of this is the if part. If Megan lives in Lansing, and then the conclusion, or our Q, is she lives in Michigan. So now this next one's a little trickier. It says a number is even if it ends in a 0. Now the word then is nowhere in here, but there will always be the word if. So look for that. So if it ends in 0, that's our hypothesis. Then as a result, a number has to be even. So sometimes it can be backwards. Some of the IXL that you're going to do today ask you to do just that. The next kind of questions you'll get will ask you to write a conditional statement from a sentence or a word picture like we have down here. So this first one asks us to write a conditional statement if I have something that says the midpoint M of a segment bisects the segment. So remember, we're just going to turn this into an if then. So we can say if M is the midpoint of a segment, then it bisects the segment. So now these word pictures here are always going to be the same. The stuff in the middle is your if, and the stuff on the outside is your then. So we got to come up with an if then. Let's take a look at this one up here. If Megan lives in Lansing, then she lives in Michigan. Let's do the same thing with this. So if you live in Okemos, then you live in Michigan. So truth values is the next thing that's up. A conditional statement has a truth value of either true or false. So some of the questions we're going to get to, it's going to ask you, is this true or false? It is false only if the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is false. So if I get paid, then I will take you out to dinner. This is only true if I get paid. If I don't get paid, then I don't have to take you out to dinner. So there's our truth value. So this says, determine if each conditional is true. If false, give a counterexample. So this first one says, if today is Monday. So we're going to assume that's true. If today is Monday, then tomorrow is Tuesday. Would that be true? And it would be. There's no other way, if today is Monday, that tomorrow could not be Tuesday. Next one says, if an angle is obtuse, so picture an obtuse angle in your mind, then it has to have a measure of 100 degrees. So some obtuse angle, does it have to have a measure of 100 degrees? Hopefully you said no to that. Because an obtuse angle just has to have something in between 90 and 180. So let's say it could measure I don't know, 142 degrees. It's still obtuse, but it doesn't have a measure of 100 degrees. So there's our counter example. Remember, we just have to give one. Next thing says, if an odd number is divisible by 2, then it is a perfect square. So think of an odd number that's divisible by 2. Hopefully you can't come up with anything because there is no odd number that is divisible by 2. So this is not possible. So this has to be false. Alright, next stuff is really the meat and potatoes of this, the stuff that we need to know. Negation. So to negate something means to cancel it out. So the negation of a statement is written not P, or we can have this little squiggly in front of it. Remember, we abbreviate everything, so even the word not is too long for us to write. So if I give you a statement like, I am going to the mall later, a negation of it simply puts the word not in there, and it has to make grammatical sense. So I am not going to the mall later. That's the negation of this statement. So you have to put not in there somewhere where it makes grammatical sense. So in addition to conditional statements, we have related conditionals. So remember, a conditional statement is if P, then Q. So we write P, then Q. We have 3 other ones that you need to know. The first one is formed by switching the hypothesis and the conclusion around. So it'll be Q, then P. This is called the converse. The converse switches them around. The next conditional statement that we need to know is formed by negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. So not P gives us not Q. This is called the inverse. And finally, the last one's a little longer. The name we give it is the contrapositive. And this one is formed by switching and negating the hypothesis. So we switch the order, so Q goes to P, but then we negate them both. So remember, that little squiggle means that we're going to throw the word not in there. So let's try some problems. So this says, write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the conditional statement, and then say if it's true or false. So here's my conditional statement. If Charlie lives in Lansing, then he lives in Michigan. So the first one I'm going to come up with is the converse. Remember, if we go back up here, the converse switches the hypothesis and the conclusion around. So the first thing we got to do is figure out what's my Q and what's my P of my original statement. So if Charlie lives in Lansing, that's my P. Then he lives in Michigan. That's my Q. So all I got to do is switch these guys around. So the converse would say, if Charlie lives in Michigan, then he lives in Lansing. Now, is that true? If somebody lives in Michigan, do they have to live in Lansing? Definitely false, because most of you live in Michigan, but do not live in Lansing. There's our counter example. So the next one we're going to do is the inverse. And remember, this negates the hypothesis and negates the conclusion. So all we're going to do is we're going to throw the word not in here, or something to that extent that makes grammatical sense. So if Charlie does not live in Lansing. Then he does not live in Michigan. So is that true? If somebody doesn't live in Lansing, then they can't live in Michigan. Hopefully, again, you said that was false because, like the last one, a lot of you don't live in Lansing, but you still live in Michigan. All right, last one is contrapositive. So remember, this one we're going to do both. We're going to switch the order, so Q comes first, and we're going to negate it. So we're going to take this piece of information and throw the word not in it. If Charlie does not live in Michigan, then he does not live in Lansing. So if somebody doesn't live in Michigan, they can't live in Lansing. That's definitely true. If you are nowhere in Michigan, you definitely can't be in Lansing. We will do much more practice with this, but if you have a specific question, make sure you write it down. Related conditional statements that have the same truth value are logically equivalent statements. Which of the previous related conditionals are logically equivalent statements? So we go back up here, and the two that were false are converse and inverse. Because they were both false. And then the two that were true were the conditional and contrapositive. Because those were both true. So obviously a lot to absorb. You have a worksheet that you can work on and must be turned into the sub before you leave today. And then you also have a couple IXLs that you can do that will help you with this stuff. Remember to write down any questions you have, and we will spend tomorrow going over this and practicing these skills. Hope you guys have a great day.